Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at the racial formation in the United States textbook, specifically chapter 4, which is part 2, racial formation. Chapter 4 is the theory of racial formation, starts on page 105, and it goes until page 136, with a lot of the ending being footnotes. This is a really important chapter. I was thinking about cutting the amount of reading, but I'm going to go over this because I think it's really important for you to understand as a foundation for race and racial formation and racism. If we start on page 105, like the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 pages are all really important. I have tons of notes in the margins of mine. The first paragraph, the very first sentence it reads, race is a way of making up people, in quotes. The very act of defining racial groups is a process fraught with confusion, contradiction, and unintended consequences. Concepts of race prove to be unreliable as supposed boundaries shift, slippages occur, realignments become evident, and new collectivities emerge. So what it's saying there in the first paragraph, first sentences, is that race changes. How we define it, how we explain it, even within different fields of study, it's not consistent. If you go to the second paragraph, it says race making can also be understood as a process of othering. This concept and idea about othering is really important. It goes on to continue, defining groups of people as, quote, other is obviously not restricted to distinctions based on race. Then they give you a whole bunch of other categories like gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, and age. And I think that this process of othering, it's something that we do. If you look at the very end sentence of that paragraph, it says, as social beings, we must categorize people so as to be able to navigate in the world, to discern quickly who may be friend or foe, to position and situate ourselves within prevailing social hierarchies, and to provide clues that guide our social interactions with the individuals and groups we encounter. So, this idea of classifying people based on perceived differences is something we do as social beings. And so the whole first few paragraphs is all about trying to understand how race is used as a social classification, and specifically how it's been used by dominant groups and or state institutions in order to maintain power and keep certain people in different brackets, so to speak. And so then that leads into the second section of reading for this chapter, which is race as a master category. Again, I have tons of notes in the margins. So intersectionality comes up in this chapter and in this category placing in terms of how other ideological concepts or other forms of intersections can change how people are read. But this idea of race as a master category, I think the beginning of that first paragraph underneath race as a master category on page 106, there's some really good questions asked here. So race is a social construction, but saying that still doesn't answer a whole bunch of questions people might have. How is race constructed? How and why do racial definitions and meanings change over time and place? And perhaps most important, what role does race play within the broader social system in which it is embedded? So if you look at race as a master category, it means that it has profoundly impacted our nation, our way of life in terms of history, politics and policy making, economic structures, our culture, the way we interact with each other and with other nations. So the authors of this textbook are telling you that no other category intersects slash influences all other categories of being as much as race. And so if you go on to page 107, they give you some examples of how race and class interact and change, how at the bottom of 107, gender and class interact and impact each other, gender, class, and race. They bring up the chattelization in terms of slavery. I think that they also, on page 108, bring up mixed race ideologies in terms of those of us that are multiracial, women's rights, and then really key, especially in terms of ethnic studies, at the bottom of 108, race as a form of resistance. So rather than it being used as a category in which groups of people are lose their agency and their ability to fight for their rights, race becomes a way of claiming power back. And that especially is really key with the civil rights movement. So that's talked about at the bottom of 108. If you continue on with the chapter, there is a section called racialization on page 109. And so this asks you to look at the process of racializing individuals and communities as either an objective aspect that we do in life or as an illusionary practice. And they look at it objectively through such fields of study like anthropology, but then the illusion aspect is more of this false consciousness, going back to race being a social construction. Why can't we go into colorblind ideology? And then they go on in the second paragraph on 1010 to say, we are critical of both positions, race as essence and race as illusion. Race is not something rooted in nature, something that reflects clear and discrete variations in human identity. But race is also not an illusion. So this idea of race not being an illusion leads us back to lived experiences by racialized bodies and individuals and communities. So claiming that race doesn't impact people's lives when it really does, doesn't reflect the process of racialization. And so that's talked a little bit about on page 111 at the very top in the first full paragraph. It says, bodies are visually read and narrated in ways that draw upon an ensemble of symbolic meanings and associations. Corporeal distinctions are common. They become essentialized. Perceived differences in skin color, physical build, hair texture, the structure of cheekbones, the shape of the nose, and then it goes on and on. So it's saying that people end up using these visual ways of reading an individual to equate the way they categorize a whole community, whether or not that's true. So if someone has a certain kind of texture or way to their hair, it could signal some kind of racial community, like a black community versus a white community versus a Latina Latino. But even those like visual readings and cues are not true. Just like if you're thinking in terms of the way we're perceived color wise, groups and communities have different shades within their communities. So you can have very fair-skinned Latinos, and they're still of a certain community. So perceiving only those with darker shades is not accurate as representing that whole community. And that goes into a whole nother concept of colorism and kind of privileging within a community itself the certain attributes, right, as being beautiful or desired qualities. So racialization is defined on page 111. I'm going to read the definition. It's right in the middle of the paragraph. We define racialization as the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. So that means racialization occurs in our individual interactions with each other and on larger macro scales. And they give you an example of the macro. Okay, so racialization occurred with the conquest and settlement of the Western Hemisphere, the development of African slavery, the rise of abolitionism. All these aspects changes the discourse of racialization and this racial formation process. So the way we interacted with each other when the transatlantic slavery was going on versus when abolitionists were fighting against chattel slavery. Okay. There's a really good summary at the bottom of 111. Race is a concept, a representation, or signification of identity. It refers to different types of human bodies, perceived, corporeal, and phenotypic markers of difference. Perceived. These are prejudices, assumptions, cliches. They're perceived truths when they're not. So that's really important to understand. That summary is at the bottom of 111. So if we go on to 112, at the very bottom of 112, they give you an idea of what their role or goal is as authors in this textbook, which is to situate racial formation historically in order to understand it better. And so that's what really the rest of the chapter does. So starting at the bottom of 112, you have the evolution of race consciousness. And this takes us as far back as the Bible, in which the Bible has some emergences of ideas of difference. However, the real, in terms of our U.S. country, the real racialization process started with the rise of Europe and the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. And that's talked about on page 113. And they go into a little bit in terms of how the, quote, old world and the new world get breached. Suddenly, the incomers that are arriving into, quote, the new world are trying to catalog the new indigenous peoples they're meeting. Capitalism comes into play in order to maintain power structures through labor and using those indigenous peoples to make more profit. They talk a little bit about discovering people and discovery as conquest, and then the seizure of territories and goods, the introduction of slavery and coerced native labor, and of course the African slave trade. So if you go to page 114, there's an important quote in the second full body paragraph. It says, the conquest, therefore, was the first, and given the dramatic nature of the case, perhaps the greatest racial formation project. Together with African slavery, it produced the master category of race, the racial template we have discussed. So really you have to understand that history to understand racialization, the racial process, and its iteration in terms of racism. Okay. So then we go from this evolution of race consciousness in order to tell the difference between one group and another group to, and it says here from religion to science on page 115. So I had mentioned before in class eugenics, and this is where scientific racism comes into play. That's discussed from 115 through 120, the top of 120. Eugenics in particular is discussed at the bottom of 116. And they give you some names that are associated with this idea of distinctiveness among humans in order to justify or rationalize the treatment of some individuals over others. So if it's scientific, it's not our fault, right? And I did have you read earlier a little bit. We discussed the Chicago sociologists. This comes up again on page 117 because it is their group that are questioning the accounts of racial difference in the 1920s. And this is before the Holocaust and Hitler's rise and the eugenics movement with that in terms of Nazi Germany. So I think it's really important that you read this section in particular a little slower. And then they give you some contemporary discussions about racial formation and science on page 118 and the bullet points from 2010 PBS airing The Faces of America with Henry Louis Gates Jr., some DNA testing, especially in terms of indigenous peoples. So I think one thing that's key to point out here as well is at the top of page 119 is that the institutional racial discrimination is a lot more covert and it's harder to recognize. So if someone's not blatantly spewing out white pride, marry someone that's white, uh, white is better or smart, you wouldn't understand the pervasiveness of racial meanings and their significances in the same regard because that's very overt. If someone would hear that and they'd say, well, that that's not right. That doesn't make sense. But the way it works institutionally is very covert. So that's talked about a little bit at the top of 119. Then it goes into the politics of racial formation. That starts on page 120. It talks a little bit about Du Bois and the social construction of race, who's considered free versus unfree, who gets to be a naturalized citizen, and who can marry whom. Remember that there was, and this is on in the middle of 121, there were what we called anti-miscegenation laws and or miscegenation laws that were forced people from other racial groups. It said it was legal to marry someone outside of your race. And a really famous case that rules this unconstitutional was in 1967 with Loving v. Virginia. So a biracial or interracial couple got married and then one of them got arrested and they fought it with the Supreme Court. So I think in terms of the political side, it's really a lot about the laws and what our U.S. government recognizes or doesn't recognize. There's a big discussion in this section on the census that starts at the middle bottom of 121. And the census and its kind of history goes on through 124. And the census is really interesting to consider because you want to be counted You want to make sure you represent your community, because this is how different groups get aid from the government. And yet at the same time, the census doesn't recognize the complexities of racial identity and racial formation. There's a really interesting discussion at the bottom of 123 about mixed race individuals and being multiracial, and how that's not captured in the census, and how data gets thrown out if you don't circle one race, and there wasn't an option to circle more than one on page 124. So those responses get tossed out from the census. And I know myself, whenever I was filling out the census, my mom would always say, represent our Mexican, our Hispanic side. Always select that, because we want to be counted in these numbers. So even though I'm biracial, I would only count that side of my community or my upbringing. So moving on, towards the end of the chapter, there's a section that's on page 124 called Racial Projects. And racial projects, the definition is on page 125 in the middle of the paragraph. And it says, racial projects do both the ideological and the practical work of making these links and articulating the connection between them. A racial project is simultaneously an interpretation, a representation, or explanation of racial identities and meaning, and an effort to organize and distribute resources. And they can be economic, political, cultural, and they get distributed along particular racial lines. Okay. So examples of racial projects. They give you an example right after that definition, the stop and frisk, in terms of cops and how they treat individuals. They mentioned Trayvon Martin. Then they also talk about on page 126, comments such as "funny you don't look black" portray a certain underlying image of what black should look like. It's the same when you say an Asian American who's not proficient in math or science, or a Latino who can't speak Spanish. It confuses a racial reading of a person. It speaks meaning to racialized projects and ways we perceive communities. And then I think a really, really important chapter or section in this chapter is this idea of racism. And it starts at the bottom of 127. Racism, they define it as a racial project is at the bottom of 128, can be defined as racist if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial signification and identities. So racial projects do not necessarily always have to be negative, but they can be racist when they reproduce dominance in which one group has more power than another, based on race. They talk a lot about anti-racism and anti-racism as an anti-racist project on 129. And it's definitely the goal of ethnic studies. It's a form of an anti-racist project. And then they do give a really interesting definition that I've read in a lot of places, the top of page 130, of racism equaling prejudice plus power, and this discussion of whether groups of people of color can be racist towards each other. And really what it ends up becoming is kind of degrouping practices. So within communities, if they're too busy fighting amongst each other, they're not working towards dismantling the racial hierarchy or racial structures or racial formations that are actually keeping people unable to achieve equality and equity with others, right? I think the ending, with racial politics, despotism, democracy, and hegemony. It's the last 3 pages. It goes from 130 to 132 before the chapter ends. And I think that really in this section, it talks about how racial projects and racial rule is understood from um, despotism to democracy, from domination to hegemony, in this coercion, in terms of we go from more of a hierarchical ruling with a king and a queen and successions based on lineage to, quote, democracy, but in a way in which not everyone gets emancipation, not everyone has freedom, not everyone has the ability to live their best lives based on these pretty pretty extreme and tragic histories that have prevented entire groups of people from um, achieving equity, because it's so ingrained in the structures and the way our life functions. So that's kind of what the hegemony side is all about. And that's really how it ends. If you have any questions on this chapter, please reach out. You really should be understanding what racial formation is, what racial projects are, what racism is, and how racialization and racial projects work in terms of conquest or consciousness building, in terms of science, and then finally in terms of politics or political history or political activism. So look for that as you're reading. Reach out via Canvas with questions. Thank you.